Greetings. Welcome to the first lecture in Sealaska Heritage Institute's series entitled, We Have Lived in Southeast Alaska Since Time Immemorial. I am Chuck Smythe, Director of the Culture and History Department. SHI has started construction of its arts campus in downtown Juneau, which will expand opportunities for education and art. If you are interested in making a donation to the arts campus, please visit sealaskaheritage.org/campus. The title of today's lecture is Ice Age Migration and Settlement in Southeast Alaska, Human Response to Climate Change. As you watch the lecture, we invite you to submit questions via the chat box in YouTube. Dr. Dixon has graciously agreed to answer questions at the end of his presentation. It is my privilege to introduce Professor Emeritus Dixon. E. James Dixon is Professor Emeritus of Anthropology and the former director of the Maxwell Museum of Anthropology at the University of New Mexico from 2007 to 2016. His areas of research include Arctic archaeology, Paleo-Indian archaeology, high altitude and high latitude adaptations, and museum science. He has served as Professor of Anthropology and Director of the Museum and Field Studies and Research Fellow in the Institute of Arctic and Alpine Research at the University of Colorado from 2000 to 2007. And prior to that, he was Curator of Archaeology at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science, and then prior to that, Professor of Anthropology, Curator of Archaeology, Director of the Alaska Quaternary Center at the University of Alaska in Fairbanks. He has published 3 books and more than 70 journal articles and book chapters. Dr. Dixon, thank you.
Well, thank you very much for that very nice introduction, Dr. Smythe. I'm trying to call up our here. There we go. So can you hear me fine?
Yeah, everything is fine.
Okay, very good. Well, thank you very much for that wonderful introduction. And I greatly appreciate the invitation to join the lecture series. And I particularly would like to thank Dr. Rosita Worrell for her gracious invitation for me to participate. So what I would like to do today is to provide a broad, excuse me, I'm still adjusting to the Zoom world, a broad overview of the first colonization, human colonization of the Americas, and within that larger global perspective, then talk, kind of drill down and look more closely at the first human occupation and the role of Southeast Alaska and the northwest coast of North America in general in the very first colonization of the Americas and the very first human settlements and adaptations along the coast. So I'll go back here just a moment. As many of you know, and I think the archaeological evidence is overwhelming, that humans first evolved in Africa. And I put in this picture here from my former colleague at the Denver Museum of Natural History, John Gurche, who is an outstanding artist, and it's a portrayal of early humans in Africa. And as many of you know, this is the heartland of our species where we evolved. And from Africa, we spread out across the globe. And ultimately, we've colonized every continent on our planet. I'm using the word colonization here in a very specific way, because I know it's used in different ways in different parts of the world. And I'm not referring to European colonization of North America or Africa or Australia. But I'm talking about the very first people to occupy a region or environment in the world. And so it's really, I'm following kind of a biological definition of colonization or species dispersal, really, which is the process of successful immigration by which a species, in this case humans, us, move into a new territory and become integrated into the new ecosystems of those regions. And this is from a biological perspective or a species dispersal perspective. Colonization is done in the absence of restrictive in the absence of restrictive force factors. Species will tend to expand to the limit of their habitat. So people moving into, let's say, the Americas will ultimately, through a gradual process, adapt to every environment on the continent and gradually occupy the entire region, only except for areas where there are things that prevent them from doing so. So what I'd like to do now is take a look at this from a global perspective. And for those of you who may be a little unfamiliar with this kind of perspective of our planet Earth, we're looking down on the world from looking at the North Pole in a so I don't know if you can see the cursor, but right here is would be the North Pole, and we're seeing the circumpolar north around that. So this would be the area where I'm moving the cursor would be Europe, Africa here where humans first evolved, Asia, and then as you come across Asia into North America, and then this would be what's today the United States. And what I've shown here, the white area, is where during the last ice age, the extent of the glacial ice that covered vast areas of the northern hemisphere, northern Asia, parts of Europe, northern Europe, parts of Eastern Asia, and then of course massive continental glacier over most of North America. Excuse me. So when we see the world from this perspective, and we realize that humans first evolved in Africa, we can see that there are really only 5 options for people to have routes that people may have taken to the Americas, the very first colonists of the Americas. One, of course, people could have come across the Atlantic and or the Pacific by transoceanic voyages. Another possibility, which has been proposed and there's some evidence for in recent years, is along the North Atlantic Rim from Northern Europe, from that direction. And another is, and the most popular and by far the most widely accepted, is that people came across Asia this way, across from Northeast Asia, across what we refer to as the Bering Land Bridge, into North America, where they would have encountered a cul-de-sac. Alaska would have been ice-free, but they would have been boxed in by glacial ice, restrictive force, of course. And another option is along the North Pacific Rim, analogous to what we saw over here on the North Atlantic Rim. So if we drill in a little closer on this, we're going to focus in on this area that's known as Beringia. You can see it's referred to up here. And this is during the last ice age, when glaciers occupied much of the northern hemisphere. Sea level dropped appreciably, and the narrow, well, not so narrow, it was more than 1,000 kilometers wide. The continental shelf between Asia and North America was exposed as dry land, forming what we refer to as the Bering Land Bridge. And probably everyone is, particularly in this audience, is probably familiar with that. This is a more traditional view, and I think most of you would be more familiar with it. So what we're seeing here is Alaska on the right, and on your right, and Northeast Asia on the left. And this really defines the limits of the continental shelf that stretched between Northeast Asia and Alaska during, well, it's still there, of course, but now it's covered by ocean. And the light green area is the area that's covered by the Bering and Chukchi Sea today, and the Gulf of Alaska along here. And is now, but during the Pleistocene, when sea level was lower, was exposed as dry land. So what I'd like to draw your attention to here is that the coastal margin here along the northwest, along the Gulf of Alaska and the northwest coast of North America, you can see there's an appreciable amount of continental shelf there as well. And ultimately, I'll be talking about that in more detail. I also would mention in this particular map, there's the extent of glacial ice is not depicted here. But this is roughly how the land would have been configured during the last glacial maximum about 20,000 years ago. Of course, the changes that came when the Ice Age drew to a close, the last Ice Age drew to a close, didn't happen all at once. They happened rather gradually. And this is a sequence of land-sea level relationships spanning a period from about the latter part of that process, from about 15,000 years ago to about 12,000 years ago. And you can see here in the upper left, as sea level rose, the Bering Land Bridge and the continental shelves along the northwest coast became smaller, more confined. Sea level rose, the water encroached on the land, and the land basically retreated as the sea level advanced. I mean, land didn't actually move, it became inundated. By 14,000 years ago, you can see that this has progressed quite a bit. And I'd like to call your attention to a long island archipelago that extends along the southern margins of the land bridge. This is a feature that was transitional. It appeared for a period of maybe 6,000 years or so, and then subsequently disappeared. As sea level rose more, all those islands became submerged. By 13,000 years ago, sea level encroached more, the archipelago is disappearing, the land bridge is getting narrower, and by 12,000 years ago, the land bridge has become very narrow, the archipelago is essentially gone, and it's not shown here, but by 10,000 years ago, the land bridge was severed for the last time. So the net result of the flooding of the land bridge was it created a vast plain that had disappeared. It was now a vast continental shelf. The land connection between Asia and North America was separated for the last time. Importantly, the Arctic Ocean and the Pacific Oceans were connected. So various species moved between those, were able to move between them. Whales, marine mammals of various types, various fish, and so forth. One of the important things for early people that were living in the region by this time was the changing landscape provided forcing mechanisms whereby the encroaching sea moved the coastline further and further landward, and people living along the coastline moved further and further landward. And as the glacial ice melted, more and more land was exposed, and new species colonized the newly exposed land, providing resources further inland. So you can see there's this kind of push-pull effect where the rising sea is pushing people further and further landward, and they're being pulled further landward by the melting ice and the resources that are being exposed beneath the ice. And these resources are not only biological resources, but various other types of natural resources in terms of stones, lithic materials suitable for making stone tools, and rivers, the emergence of rivers and lakes and so forth. So the traditional model, and many of you are very aware of this, I'm sure, is the people from Asia migrated across the Bering Land Bridge into what is now Alaska, and they found this very pristine continent unoccupied by other people. These Pleistocene animals, mammoths, bison, a number of species that had never encountered human predators before, and people rapidly expanded into this new habitat. And as the traditional paradigm goes, they were able to move through what was called an ice-free corridor, a narrow passage through that continental glacier that we saw earlier. It's referred to as an ice-free corridor. It was on that map. It's called the mid-continental route, where people came through the interior of the continent. And when they arrived south of those massive ice sheets, they encountered mammoths, which they according to the standard paradigm, had not evolved fear of humans. These new predators showed up. They didn't know how to deal with them. They were relatively easy prey for human hunters, and human hunters brought these animals to extinction. And of course, this theory made great sense. And this is a picture of an archaeological excavation at a site in Colorado called the Dent site. And this is a site where the very first evidence of stone artifacts were found in association with mammoth bones. So these are the mammoth bones. Here you can see these large bones. This photo was taken actually as part of a film clip, a very rare film clip that is at the Denver Museum of Natural History. And this is taken in the very early 1930s. And as these men were digging, they found several stone points with these mammoth bones. Well, this was part of led to be a great story, where later at the famous Clovis site in New Mexico, similar remains were found, and then throughout North America. So people realized that humans had hunted mammoths in Asia. They came to North America. They came down through the ice-free corridor. There were mammoths. It was a nice story that they were adapted to this as big game hunters, hunting mammoths and other large ice age animals in a terrestrial kind of setting in North America. These are the very first Clovis points, they're called. Even though they were found at Dent, Colorado, they were subsequently found at Clovis, New Mexico. And these are photographs of the very original specimens, and they're very distinctive. You can see that they're long, lancelet kind of points. They have these concave bases. If you could touch them, you would feel that these edges are ground where they're hafted onto a spear point or a dart point being thrown with an atlatl. And characteristically, they have these very diagnostic flutes coming up from the base right here. So this is a very distinctive type of artifact that is associated with these Paleo-Indian hunters. And they were called that after these discoveries with the Ice Age animals. Well, we talked about species dispersal and colonization and restrictive forces. So what I'd like to do is do a more refined look. And this map that you're seeing here depicts the limit of glacial ice about 18,000 years ago. Okay, so just right after the last ice age, you can see here's the Bering Land Bridge that we looked at before. Here's contemporary Alaska. And then Alaska is blocked from the rest of the continent to the south by this massive glacier. But if you look along the coastline here, you can see that there are refugia on glaciated places along the coast. In places, ice does come out to the coast, to block any kind of landward movement along the coast. But there are these isolated pockets or refugia along the coast. And we know those existed for a number of reasons. One, my colleague Tim Heaton and others have found animal remains in caves that date to this time period, to about 20,000 years ago. Arctic fox, ring seal, these are animals that are associated with high Arctic environments today. So this coast looked more like maybe the fauna of the Arctic archipelago up here with ring seals and Arctic fox and so forth. A severe environment with glaciers but nevertheless with pockets of ice-free areas along the coast. If you look at this about 2,000 years later, you can see that just about the entire coastline is ice-free by this time. What's more important to realize here is this ice moved out toward the coast in this direction. The tremendous weight of the ice once suppressed the land that it was on, but as it moved forward, it created what's called a forebulge. In other words, the land in front of it rose up to a much higher level. So it's like pushing your shoe along a carpet, and how the rug will move in front of you like a little wave. So did the land in front of the ice. So the land was much higher on the continental shelf in front of the glacial ice here than it is today. And then when the ice melted, this collapsed. When this weight was relieved, the forebulge collapsed, and the land slowly began to rise up where the glaciers had been, because the weight had been released of the glaciers pressing down on it. So it's a very complex land sea level relationship we're looking at here, with a relatively very rapid sea level rise with the collapse of the forebulge along the northwest coast. Recent research along this area of the northwest coast shows that this deglaciation process began about 17,000 years ago. And so there were isolated pockets, refugia along the coast that in which plants and animals survived in some places. And then by 17,000 years ago, the entire coast began to be deglaciated, and these refugia became connected to each other, and the environment was changing very rapidly. The high Arctic species, ringed seal and Arctic fox, disappeared, and they were replaced by more contemporary species. And by 15,000 years ago, you can see that, let's see, just want to go back here. So you can also see that the interior route here, this is where the mammoth hunters and so forth should have come through, still blocked by ice. By 14,000 years ago, the interior route has opened. The northwest coast is very much ice-free. It's about all of it. And the narrow deglaciation corridor has opened up in the central part of the continent with these blue areas are proglacial lakes. This is meltwater coming out of the glaciers, forming these big proglacial lakes. You can see the Great Lakes are just beginning to form here in North America. But the northwest coast is already ice-free, available for human occupation, and has been for several thousand years. By 13,000 years ago, now there's a broad expanse between the two ice sheets. Northwest coast is very much like it is today. And we have the first evidence of large mammals moving through this area, coming from the south and the north. There's a site known as Charlie Lake Cave right here, and there are two different species of bison. In the south, there's the kind of the bison antiquus, it's called. It's a distinctively North American bison, and in the north, there's another bison. It's called a clade, and it's a bison priscus, or the Asiatic form of bison. And as the ice retreats, the northern bison moves southward, the southern bison move northward, and both species are found, or subspecies are found here at Charlie Lake Cave by about 12,500 years ago. And many ecologists believe these are good proxies for when this deglaciation corridor is biologically viable for human occupation, maybe slightly before this, because bison travel very fast, they move fast, and the fact that the species are coming from both directions and are represented here. So we can say that certainly by about 12,500, 13,000 years ago, people are able to move through this region of North America as well. Here's just a picture of Charlie Lake Cave. Oh, and yes, at Charlie Lake Cave, lo and behold, there's one of these very Clovis-like looking projectile points or stone tools found there. You see it's very much like the Clovis. It's got the round base. This is probably a broken one that's been resharpened and resharpened. So it's a little stubby, but it's got this fluting or basal thinning from the base, from the bottom up, very similar. So the idea is that this is related to those Paleo-Indian points we saw from the more southern parts of the continent associated with mammoth hunting. And just to give you an idea what the excavations of Charlie Lake Cave look like, very deep deposit. So this evidence is quite solid. It's well buried and it's in place, and it provides a good chronology for both these species and this type of technology. And we just happen to have a picture of the two bison types meeting in the deglaciation quarter, very rare photograph. So just to kind of provide an overview of just what I was talking about, we can see here we're starting at about 18,000 years ago, right up here in the upper left, and you can see that the continent's covered with glaciers. There are some refugia and ice-free pockets along the northwest coast. Parts of the continental shelf are exposed as dry land and unglaciated. By 16,000, this is 16,000 right here, the coast is essentially ice-free and available for human occupation. But the interior route is still closed. By 15,000 years ago, you can see the interior corridor is just opening up, still filled with a lot of meltwater lakes and unstable ice. It's a very narrow passage, probably not biotically viable, if so, marginally viable. And this persists up until about, this is 14,000 years ago, until about 13,000 years ago when the corridor is wide enough, sometime between this and 12,500 years ago, people could be in the, this would be biologically viable. So when Charlie Lake Cave is documented, and then it's fully opened by, I think this is 12.5 here. So the take-home message here is that the coastal fringe of North America, the Northwest coast and Gulf of Alaska area, is ice-free earlier. In other words, there aren't restrictive forces to block human dispersals in this area during the very late Ice Age. Okay, and this is what some of these Clovis points look like. And spent a lot of time on those. Oh, but yes, I do want to make the point. So these Clovis points are very typical of this Paleo-Indian culture, if you will, that exists in the southern areas of North America. But in eastern Beringia and Alaska at the same time, there's a very different technology. People are making very different types of tools out of different types of materials. And they rely largely on what are called microblades. These are these little things right up here. These are like little razors of stone that are inset in the sides of antler and bone artifacts to make a cutting edge. They're used hafted in handles as like little X-Acto knives for cutting hides and doing all sorts of work. It's very conservative of the stone material. Uses it very conservatively. It's believed to be a high latitude adaptation where people living in frozen environments who can't access stone throughout much of the year because it's frozen under the ground and in the ice and under the snow tend to be very conservative with their use of stone. They can carry these little stone cores around with them, always press off these microblades, and have plenty of cutting material throughout the long winters. So it's really seen as a high latitude adaptation, whereas the Clovis technology is very extravagant in the use of stone. It is a very different adaptation to a more temperate environment, and they're very distinctive. So what this tells us is that by around 13,000 years ago, there are 13 to 14,000 years ago already developed in North America two very distinctive technological traditions, two or more. So, excuse me. So let's take a little closer look at the Northwest coast here. And this is the period by about 16,000 years ago. This is basically a blow up of the earlier slide that I showed, just focusing on Northwest coast. And you can see this coastline is ice-free all the way down to Seattle. There are a few places where glacial ice may have come out to the, I'll show you a picture like this, where glaciers came out to the coast. This is a slide from the, or a photograph from Greenland today, where ice, came all the way out to the edge of the continental shelf. But most of the coastline was ice-free by this time, and we know that there were plants and animals inhabiting this entire coastline. So just to kind of recap here before I get start focusing in more on the archaeology and the evidence from Southeast Alaska. Glaciation reached its maximum extent around 20,000 years ago, and during that time, the ice conditions were severe, and as they began to melt, some plants and animals that survived in these refugia along the Northwest coast persisted along the Northwest coast, I'm sorry, as the ice receded and recolonized adjacent areas. Some became regionally extinct, such as ring seal and Arctic fox. So just to give you an idea, this is the Northwest coast. So here's Juneau right here. Here's a large map of Alaska, Canada, USA, the continental USA, or the lower 48. That's probably more appropriate. And I just want to let you know that these are just these red dots all represent sites, and there are many more now along this coastline where we have found fossil evidence supporting the fact that there were refugia along the coast during the last ice age, and that a long record of plant and animal life at various locales all along this way. So this is not just a scenario that's developed from one or two sites, but it's an emerging pattern of the changing environment along the evolution of the environment along the Northwest coast, and people along with it. So I talked about sea level and the forebulging effect and so forth, and I've used this slide. It's of the Gwaii-Hyannis region south of near the Queen Charlotte, Haida Gwaii near what we used to call or used to be called the Queen Charlotte Islands. The native name is by far the preferred name now. So what we can see here is, if you just take a quick look at this, I don't want to bore you with a lot of charts and graphs, but this is modern sea level where I'm running the laser cursor along here. And this is time. This is present, and we're going back in time along the bar here at the top of the graph. So this is in thousands of years. So this is 1,000 years ago, 2,000, 3, 4, and so forth. Modern sea level. And then this shows how sea level has changed over time. Okay, and they're in two different chronological formats, one radiocarbon years and one calendar years. And we'll just use calendar years to keep it straightforward. And I've been trying to speak in calendar years throughout this presentation. So what we can see is at the end of the last ice age, about 15,000 years ago or so, sea level rose rapidly in relationship to the land. Okay, very rapidly, in fact, so rapidly that it actually became higher than it is today, and then slowly tapered off until its current level today. Now, keep in mind, this is a land-sea level relationship where the land is rebounding from the weight of the ice, the forebulge is collapsing, and sea level is rising. So it's a kind of a complex set of factors. But what we can see is in around, 10,000 years ago here, a little bit older, 10,000, say, to 9,500 years ago, that at this point in time, all along the coast, a little higher elevation than the coast, and my colleagues, Risa Carlson and Jim Batesville, have really done a great job of working this out, are a whole number of archaeological sites that all of a sudden appear at these higher levels right at this time. In other words, when sea level gets up above the modern level, all of a sudden all these archaeological sites appear. This suggests to them that a great number of people, that many people were living further out on the continental shelf, and that when sea level rose and kind of stabilized at this point, those archaeological sites of those people are now recorded in those locales, and that people were basically retreating from rising sea level, and that older sites, of course, are out on the continental shelf, submerged under the water, under the sea today. So this is just give you an idea of some of the other sites, archaeological sites throughout the region. These are various cave sites and so forth. This is a site called Cave 1 site that was in British Columbia. That was excavated by a colleague of mine, Daryl Fedge, where between around, this would be about 12,500 years ago. This is in radiocarbon years, but about 12,500 years ago, found bare bones and a couple of stone tools. Here's the bases of what he believes are large spear points or knives. Here's a couple of more caves that he also excavated, dating to about the same time period, a little bit later. Once again, bare bones and other animal bones and stone tools. Again, with this very distinctive, these stone points with these very distinctive rounded bases. They don't look anything like the microblades that we saw from interior Alaska or the Clovis points that we saw in the other slides from the lower 48. This is the other Gadudin 2 cave, same kind of pattern, these U-shaped knives and animal bones, 13,000-year-old site. So my point here is that there are a number of sites that have been emerging along the northwest coast that are contemporaneous with Clovis and Folsom, which is another slightly younger archaeological culture, if you will, in the lower 48, that is similar to Clovis, and that we have a very distinctive number of artifacts that have a very different shape and suggest a different group of people, different adaptation at least. And here we have some examples from Prince of Wales Island. These examples are from Shukaka Cave, which is the northern end of Prince of Wales Island. And they, once again, resemble very much the ones that have been found in British Columbia. They have these kind of bipointed kind of characteristics. These are the bases. This one's broken off at the base. If you could touch them, you feel a little grinding along the base, and they're a very distinctive, different type of artifact. Some of them made of obsidian. Some of them tend to be a little stemmed at the base. They've probably been resharpened and reused. So now I'd like to turn to Prince of Wales Island and share with you some of the discoveries that have been made there that are relevant to this concept that people may have first come to North America along the northwest coast. This is called Shukaka Cave. This is an artist's rendition of the cave, of what it looked like at the time it was used, or one of the times. It was actually used about 9 different times. We have evidence from 9 different intervals of use. The most extensive use was around 10,500 years ago and 8,000 years ago. So this is the entrance to the cave. It's got a very characteristic hourglass shape When we discovered this cave, it was filled all the way up to almost to the top with sediment. So this drawing tries to portray the cave as what it looked like when people used it. And here's a man making a stone tool near the front. And this spear has got the exact type of spear point that we showed in the previous slide. So it's reconstructed or redrawn, the plants growing nearby and so forth, very much to what it must have looked like around 10 to 11,000 years ago. Excuse me. So Shukaka was a man whose remains were found in the cave. The name Shukaka means man ahead of us. He was a young man in his early 20s when he died on Prince of Wales Island about 10,500 years ago. He received his name from the Council of Elders that was convened by the Sealaska Heritage Institute. And his remains were studied between the time he was discovered or found. He was actually accidentally found by Timothy Heaton, paleontologist who was working in the cave, who's not an archaeologist, but and Shukaka was reburied in 2008 by the Craig Tribal Association, the Cooperative Association, with cooperation support from the U.S. Forest Service and Sealaska Heritage Institute. Interestingly, Shukaka himself is only represented by 11 bones. This is a schematic of a human skeleton, and the red parts here actually are the bones that were found inside the cave of this young man. So there are 206 bones in an adult human body, but only 11 were found in the cave. None of his other remains were found, and they were found scattered in the cave. They weren't in one particular spot. Some of them were close together, others were not. And all of the bones show signs of abrasion, gnawing, wear. So it's clear that his bones, the ones that were preserved in the cave, came from somewhere else. This is not a human burial. He was not buried in the cave, and his bones seem to have been transported into the cave, probably by foxes, is what we think, based on the size of the tooth marks on some of the bones and the abrasion on some of them. So the analysis of his remains tell quite a story. I had a conversation once with Clarence Jackson, who is a traditional scholar and a respected elder, who expressed the opinion that Shukaka came to the people of Southeast Alaska at a time when they needed him. And he came because he had a story to share and tell. So I'm honored to have been part of helping share his story. And I believe that Clarence's comments are recorded in a video that was done by the Sealaska Heritage Institute, discussing the consultation process associated with the discovery, analysis, and reburial of Shukaka's remains. But this is a cast in the background. You're seeing here a cast, so it's not the original bone of Shukaka's mandible, his lower jaw. You saw in that schematic before that it is one of the few bones preserved. We know that Shukaka is a man, one, because his mandible was very robust, which tends to be the case with humans. It's not definitive proof of sex, but also you saw part of his pelvis was preserved, and it had a very diagnostic part called a sciatic notch, which indicated he was male as well. And then subsequent DNA analysis conclusively proved that he is male. So there's no doubt there. But also in the analysis, the one of his teeth, his molars, was removed and replaced, sampled and replaced, and it yielded information about his diet. This is a graph that was put together, chart put together by my colleague Tim Heaton, which looks at the carbon isotope values, the carbon-13 isotope values for various types of animals that live in Southeast and have lived in Southeast Alaska since the Ice Age. And so if you look at this graph on the left side over here, these values are indicative of terrestrial feeders. So here, if you look, you see we have terrestrial plants, we have beaver, deer, so forth. Some intrusion here on this slide, but and as we move toward the right of the graph, we start to see we have different species. We have marmot, black bear. We start to get into mixed feeders, caribou, various carnivores, herbivores. And as we move further over, then pretty soon we start to see we have Arctic fox, fish, whale, fish, and here's Shukaka way over here on the right. This tells us that Shukaka was raised on marine food. In other words, he was raised on a seafood, primarily a seafood diet. He was a marine, probably hunter, and raised on marine foods primarily. So this was a very important clue to his lifestyle. I'd also say that if you looked at his teeth, he did not have a cavity. His teeth were completely healthy, but you could tell from striations on his teeth that he had suffered at least twice in his young adult years when he was growing up, times of dietary stress. In other words, he probably experienced periods of hunger and dietary stress at least twice in his life. And for a man in his early 20s, he probably experienced some hard times. If we look at compare his isotope values with other people around the world, how we know that this is a very maritime signature, marine adapted signature, is that here are the Saddlermute. This is a group of people that lived on an island in Hudson's Bay. They made their living primarily from the sea. Ancient Aleut, people that lived on the Aleutian Islands in the North Pacific, a very high marine diet. And then here's Shukaka. And if you look at these nitrogen values, which are also indicative of his marine diet, and the carbon values, it's quite clear that his dietary signature is very similar to theirs. So here's this is very, very strong evidence that of maritime adaptations. So we saw in the earlier, I'll just continue on this for a minute. In the earlier slide, we saw some obsidian, volcanic glass in the artifacts. We were able to trace these obsidian sources. Some of the obsidian comes from Mount Aziza in British Columbia. Some of it comes from Sunez Island to the south of Prince of Wales Island. This obsidian could only have reached Shukaka Cave by water, by boat, by people transporting it. The marine diet of Shukaka is quite clear that he was made his living from the sea. And all of this evidence together clearly indicates a maritime adaptation. People were very experienced at the sea. They had developed trade networks or traveled along the coast, transporting obsidian. And we've also found quartz crystal and other exotic types of rocks that were very probably economically important and valued. And collectively, these data show that by 10,500 years ago, maybe 11,000 years ago, people, when sea level was reached its high point, people appear in great numbers along the coast. They've already developed trade networks, and they're well adapted to that environment. This tells us that, along with data from other earlier sites of British Columbia to the south, and also there's an early artifact from Shukaka cave that dates to 12,000 years ago, a little bit older, that people were around and had settled that area for a long time. They had discovered these sources of stone. They developed trade networks. They were able to. They were good coastal navigators and well adapted to a marine environment. This doesn't happen overnight, and it takes a great deal of time to develop this level of population density and adaptation. So just kind of to recap here a little bit, the coastal migration corridor for people coming out of Asia into North America is open and ecologically viable at least 3,500 years prior to an interior corridor. This suggests that maybe the very first people to enter the Americas came along the Northwest coast. And so some of the oldest residents of the American continent are probably ancestors are along the Northwest coast of North America. The, let's see, and to kind of recap, the Northwest coast was occupied by humans until the late Pleistocene. In other words, the end of toward the last ice age. As glaciers melted, the landward retreat or kind of pushing effect of rising sea level and the pulling effect of newly deglaciated regions were forcing mechanisms that enable people to move inland and colonize the coast and adapt to this very rapidly changing, these very rapidly changing ecosystems. The American continents provided a new habitat, enabling the eastward expansion of people into new territories and the integration into emerging ecosystems. And I think we can see this reflected in those early types of tools that we're looking at. In the far north, the kind of the very high latitude adapted microblade cultures, the mammoth hunters of the Western Plains and the Clovis complex or artifacts. And then, of course, this emerging kind of leaf-shaped point technology, maritime technology that we're seeing now discovering along the Northwest coast. So the earliest settlers along the Northwest coast undoubtedly used watercraft and were based on a marine subsistence economy. So I'd just like to conclude here with Shukaka's headstone, and I think it's a fitting testimony to the lecture series that the Sealaska Heritage Institute is sponsoring, and it acknowledges the great time depth of people along the Northwest coast and the message that Shukaka brought forward in time to us. And with that, I would like to say thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jim. Perhaps you could stop screen sharing.
Oh, yes, of course.
We will now take questions. If you have any questions, please submit them via YouTube. I have one, which has to do with the idea of refugia, and you were saying by 14,000 years ago, the refugia were pretty much gone. That the whole entire coast was pretty much ice-free, except for places like maybe Glacier Bay that may have been filled with glacial ice coming down from the mountains. But I wonder if you could just go into that a little bit more and explain what a refugium would be. I mean, could a small community live in one of those areas for a generation or something? Or Is that too hard to say?
Well, no, it's a very good question. Thank you, whomever asked it. And yes, we know for a fact the refugia are basically areas of land that were ice-free during the last ice age. So we know that when the glaciers expanded westward along the continental shelf out to the coast, they didn't cover the entire continental shelf, and there were large areas that were not glaciated during the last ice age. And but they were surrounded by ice on three sides and the ocean on the westward side. So within these areas, we know that plants and animals persisted. In fact, my colleague Tom Ager believes that they may have even had, or has suggested that they may have even had trees in them, shore pine, because when the ice retreats, shore pine appears immediately as the first tree species in these areas. And it's hard to believe that they colonized all the way from the south all the way up the coast so quickly. So it's quite possible that these refugia may have had some trees in them, shore pine. There were certainly marine mammals and uh, and Arctic fox, and possibly even caribou. You know, there was a relic herd of caribou in Haida Gwaii that became extinct around the turn of the last century. We have found some caribou bones in the caves of Southeast Alaska. So it may be a more Arctic-like environment. Now, whether there were caribou in these refugia, we don't know. But it's some people have suggested that people were able to skirt the glacial ice and kind of island hop between these refugia, living in them possibly for periods of time or maybe for long periods of time. We just don't know. The answer to these questions are really largely underwater on the continental shelf, and we've done a little research into that. We've done some underwater survey, some coring. There are some sediment cores that also um, um, provide some evidence as well. So, but it's a great research frontier that we know very little about. But we do know the refugia did exist, that animals lived in them, and possibly even some trees, possibly pine.
Well, it's an exciting time when you're talking about what could be discovered through through further archaeological research. We've been approached by investigators from different universities looking to do undersea archaeology within the island areas, like around POW, for example, because there's a high potential for finding additional sites.
Yeah, I think that's one of my former students, maybe.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, it's very exciting. Well, really appreciate your talk, and it's been very enlightening. I think it certainly portrays a different picture of how Southeast Alaska was inhabited, not just as a transitory place, but as a place where people stayed. I mean, to develop trade routes and all. Would you agree with that? That it was less. It wasn't just can't be just characterized as a transit area to south to further south.
Oh, no, no, I believe it's, once people were there, a resident population developed, and then, people on as they kept colonizing further and further south, then, right on down the coast of South America, probably, with people resident uh, along the way.
Uh-huh. Sure.
Hi, Jim.
Oh, hi, Rosita.
How are you? I just wanted to say thank you to Jim and let everybody know that I think what happened with our work, our collaborative work, is a great example of what can happen when scientists work with indigenous people and with tribes. And I think this is probably one of the best and earliest examples that we have, in scientific work in North America. So I just wanted to thank Jim for that. And I know Terry Fifield, who was with the Forest Service, is also online. So I want to also acknowledge him that it was great collaboration with the scientists, the tribes, and SHI. And we also want to thank Sealaska because they also provided, some of our interns were able to work with the scientists, and I encourage them to go on into, doing more scientific work in their studies. So I just think a lot of good has come out of it, and we've said that it's reaffirmed, the oral traditions that indigenous people have lived here, for 10,000 years at least. So we owe a great debt to the scientists, and I just wanted to thank you personally, Jim, and also Terry, who's online, and just say it was a great adventure, and hopefully we're going to find out more about our early ancient history. So thank you. I know we have a lot more questions, but I don't know if we have any more time. But thank you, Jim.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you very much.
Mhm.
And I just wanted to mention, as Jim mentioned, we have created a video that describes the consultation process from the time of discovery through the decision-making process of proceeding, the difficult decisions made to proceed with scientific excavation and study of the remains and of the cave. And then the results of that research, which is available through our shop. It's a very useful explanation of the process, both relating to NAGPRA, but also just relating to a really good model for how scientists can work with local tribes and communities. And I wanted to commend Jim for being very forward-looking to do that at that time, very open and interested to pursue that approach. So thank you, Jim Dixon. SHI invites viewers to return for our next lecture by Professor Ripon S. Molly, entitled Paleogenomics, Community Engagement and Evolutionary Histories of Indigenous Peoples of Southeast Alaska and the North Coast of British Columbia, which will be broadcast next Thursday, this coming Thursday, 2 days from now, January 14th at noon. We have a link below the YouTube video for a survey we hope you will take a moment to complete. This will help us to continue improving our lecture series and to allow our funders to measure the impact of the program, which is helpful to us. SHI has started construction of its arts campus in downtown Juneau, which will expand opportunities for education and art. If you are interested in making a donation to the arts campus, please visit sealaskaheritage.org/campus. Thank you, and see you again on Thursday.